In the ancient world, on a bustling shore of the Mediterranean, stood a building that contained a dream greater than any empire, the collective knowledge of all humanity. The Library of Alexandria was a fortress of the mind, its shelves groaning under the weight of 1,000,000 scrolls. But how was this great library lost? And was its destruction the single greatest setback in human history? The story begins not with a scholar, but with the greatest conqueror the world had ever seen. Alexander of Macedon, a man who had wept that there were no worlds left to conquer, envisioned a new kind of kingdom, one built not just on military might, but on the fusion of cultures. And so, on the fertile coast of Egypt, he ordered the construction of a city that would bear his name, Alexandria. But Alexander would not live to see his dream realized, dying in Babylon and leaving his vast empire to be torn apart by his squabbling generals. From the chaos, one man emerged to claim Egypt as his own, Ptolemy, son of Lagus. A shrewd and cunning commander, Ptolemy understood that to rule was to control more than just land. It was to control culture, knowledge, and the very narrative of history. And so, he looked upon the fledgling city of Alexandria and saw its true potential. It would not merely be a Greek outpost in Egypt. It would be the intellectual capital of the world, a beacon of learning that would outshine even Athens itself. The heart of this grand project would be a library, but not just any library. This would be the library, with a capital L. Its mission was as simple as it was audacious, to collect every single book ever written. Ptolemy envisioned a complete archive of human knowledge, from the epic poems of Homer to the medical texts of Hippocrates, from the geometry of Euclid to the histories of Babylon. It was a goal of impossible ambition, a testament to the boundless confidence of the Hellenistic age. To achieve this, the Ptolemies, beginning with Ptolemy I Soter, and continuing with his son Ptolemy II Philadelphus, employed a ruthless and brilliant strategy. Every ship that docked in Alexandria's magnificent harbour, the largest in the ancient world, was boarded by royal officials. They would search for scrolls, and any found were confiscated on the spot. The scrolls were then taken to the library, where an army of scribes would copy them with meticulous care. The copies were then given back to the ship's owners, while the originals were kept for the library's collection, stamped with the phrase, "From the ships." This was state-sponsored intellectual piracy on an industrial scale. But their methods did not stop there. They sent emissaries to the far corners of the known world, to the great games of Olympia and the markets of Athens, with vast sums of gold to purchase or borrow priceless texts. One of the most famous tales involves the Athenian state archives, which possessed the official copies of the plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. The Ptolemies offered a colossal security deposit of 15 talents of silver, a fortune to borrow them. The Athenians, trusting in the pledge, agreed. Ptolemy III, however, had no intention of returning them. He forfeited the deposit without a second thought, keeping the original manuscripts for his library and sending back the cheap copies he had made. For him, the original knowledge was worth infinitely more than its weight in silver. The library was more than a repository. It was a living, breathing university. It was part of the larger Museum, or Temple of the Muses, a research institution that offered a salary, free meals, and lodging to the greatest minds of the era. Here, free from the burdens of everyday life, scholars could dedicate themselves entirely to the pursuit of knowledge. And so it was that Alexandria became a magnet for genius. It was here that the mathematician Euclid compiled his Elements, the foundational textbook of geometry that would be used for the next 2,000 years. It was here that Aristarchus of Samos first proposed the radical, heretical idea that the Earth revolved around the Sun, a theory that would be forgotten and then rediscovered millennia later. It was here that Eratosthenes, using little more than a stick and his brilliant mind, calculated the circumference of the Earth with astonishing accuracy, proving the world was a sphere. The library's ambition even extended to the sacred texts of other cultures. Ptolemy II, it is said, commissioned the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek. He invited 72 Jewish scholars, 6 from each of the 12 tribes, to Alexandria. Working in separate cells, they miraculously produced 72 identical Greek translations. This work, known as the Septuagint, became the version of the Old Testament used by the early Christian church. The library was not just preserving Greek knowledge, it was actively creating a universal library, a bridge between all human cultures. The scrolls were organized with a system invented by the poet and scholar Callimachus, who created the Pinakes, a 120-volume catalogue that was the first comprehensive library index in history. The air in the scriptorium would have been thick with the smell of papyrus and ink, the silence broken only by the scratching of style and the soft rustle of scrolls being unrolled. Scholars debated in the shaded colonnades, their arguments echoing under the vaulted ceilings. For nearly 3 centuries, the Library of Alexandria was the brain of the world, a place where humanity's collective intellect burned brighter than ever before. But a flame that burns so brightly also casts a long shadow. The very greatness of the library made it a target, a symbol of power and prestige that would be caught in the crossfire of empires, religions, and the relentless march of history. Its destruction would not come in a single catastrophic event, but as a series of blows, a slow, agonizing death by 1,000 cuts that would plunge the world into a darkness from which it would take centuries to recover. The golden age of the library could not last forever. The very knowledge it hoarded made it a glittering prize, and the city of Alexandria, a strategic jewel on the Mediterranean, found itself in the crosshairs of a new, ascending power, the Roman Republic. The first great disaster to befall the library was not born of a desire to destroy knowledge, but from the ruthless ambition of one of history's most famous figures, Julius Caesar. In 48 BC, Caesar was pursuing his rival, Pompey, into Egypt, only to find himself embroiled in the complex and bloody civil war between the young Queen Cleopatra VII and her brother, Ptolemy XIII. Caesar, backing Cleopatra, found himself and his legions besieged within the royal palace quarter of Alexandria, which bordered the harbour and was adjacent to the city's warehouse district, where vast numbers of the library's scrolls were, stored for export and transport. The fighting was fierce and chaotic. To prevent the Egyptian fleet of Ptolemy XIII from surrounding him, Caesar made a desperate tactical decision. He sent his men to set fire to the ships in the harbour. The plan worked, but the fire, fanned by the coastal winds, raged out of control. The flames leaped from the wooden hulls of the ships onto the docks, and then began to consume the warehouses themselves. Warehouses that, according to the Roman historian Seneca, contained 40,000 scrolls, a vast auxiliary collection of the great library. Imagine the scene: the night sky glowing a hellish orange, the air thick with smoke and the screams of men, the priceless papyrus scrolls, containing plays by Sophocles, histories of Babylon, and scientific treatises, turning not to ash, but to glowing embers that floated out over the dark water. Caesar himself, in his own account, makes only a brief, clinical mention of the fire spreading to some buildings. Near the dock, a stark understatement of a cultural catastrophe. It was a devastating blow, an act of collateral damage in a political squabble that erased a significant portion of humanity's written memory in a single night. The library's main complex, the museum itself, may have survived, but its heart was wounded. This was the first major fire, a warning of the vulnerability of concentrated knowledge in a world of shifting power. And so it was that the first great burning of the Library of Alexandria was not an act of barbarism, but a calculated military maneuver that went horribly wrong, a lesson that the pursuit of power often tramples the pursuits of the mind. In the centuries that followed, Alexandria and its wounded library endured, but under the heavy shadow of Rome. The city remained a centre of learning, but the vibrant, independent spirit of the Ptolemaic era was fading. The Roman emperors saw the library as a symbol of prestige, but they were not its passionate guardians. They were its exploiters. The great minds were no longer drawn there with the same fervour. The flame of discovery was flickering. Then, in the 3rd century AD, another catastrophe struck. This one born of outright war. The Palmyrene Empire, led by the ambitious Queen Zenobia, rebelled against Rome and swept into Egypt, capturing Alexandria in 270 AD. The Roman Emperor Aurelian, a soldier of brutal efficiency, marched to retake the city. The battle for Alexandria was furious, fought street by street, and the Bruttium district, the royal quarter where the main library was housed, was laid waste. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing a century later, would note that when he saw Alexandria, the Bruttium was already a ruin. It is widely believed that during Aurelian's reconquest, the main library building, or what remained of it, was finally and systematically destroyed, either burned or dismantled in the fighting. If Caesar's fire was an accident, Aurelian's sack was a deliberate act of urban devastation aimed at crushing a rebellious city. The Great Hall of Muses, the walking colonnades where Aristotle's successors had debated, the very heart of the library, was likely reduced to rubble and ash in this conflict. The knowledge that survived was perhaps a scattered remnant, what scholars could carry away or what was stored in a daughter library located in the Serapeum, a magnificent temple to the Greco-Egyptian god Serapis on a hill in the Rakotis district of the city. But the world was changing in a way far more profound than the simple shift of imperial power. A new force was rising, one that viewed the old knowledge not as a treasure, but as a threat. Christianity, once a persecuted sect, became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Emperor Theodosius I in the late 4th century. Theodosius issued a series of decrees outlawing pagan worship, and his zeal was matched by Theophilus, the Patriarch of Alexandria. Theophilus, a powerful and dogmatic bishop, saw the Serapeum, with its vast collection of pagan texts, as an affront to the one true God. In 391 AD, he incited a Christian mob to attack the temple. This was not a battle between armies, but a holy war waged by a fervent crowd against stone and parchment. The mob, convinced of their divine righteousness, stormed the Serapeum. They toppled the colossal statue of Serapis, a symbol of religious syncretism that had stood for centuries, and dragged its pieces through the streets. They then set about the systematic destruction of the temple complex and its contents. The daughter library housed within, the last significant repository of the ancient world's classical learning, was almost certainly destroyed. The scrolls were torn, burned, or scattered. This was an ideological cleansing, a deliberate attempt to erase a competing worldview. The philosopher Hypatia, a renowned teacher and mathematician who symbolized the classical learning of Alexandria, was herself brutally murdered by a Christian mob in 415 AD, torn limb from limb with pottery shards. Her death was the final, bloody punctuation mark on the end of an era. The great flame of the library was not just extinguished by fire and sword, but smothered by a new dogma that had little patience for the questioning, philosophical spirit that had built it. The slow death was now complete. The buildings were gone, the scrolls were ash, the scholars were silent or dead. A silence fell over the place where the world's knowledge had once lived, a silence that would the dust settled over Alexandria. The mobs dispersed, the fires cooled, and the stones of the Serapeum were quarried for new churches. But what was the true cost of this silence? What exactly was lost in those successive waves of destruction? To understand the magnitude of the setback, we must move beyond the abstract idea of lost scrolls and give voice to the silenced. We must mourn the specific books, the specific ideas, whose absence left a void in the collective human mind. Imagine the plays of the Greek tragedians. We possess 7 each from Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. But the library held the complete works. It is believed Aeschylus wrote between 70 and 90 plays, Sophocles over 120, and Euripides around 92. The 7 we have are the ones that were popular enough, copied widely enough, to survive the winnowing process of time. The rest, the majority of the output of these foundational geniuses of Western drama, were unique copies stored in Alexandria. They vanished, their stories, their poetry, their insights into the human condition, gone forever. The loss is not just a number, it is the erasure of a cultural continent. Now, consider the sciences. The work of Aristarchus of Samos, who proposed a heliocentric universe 1,800 years before Copernicus, was preserved in the library. After the library's decline, his radical idea was suppressed, forgotten, and even mocked by later thinkers who had only fragments of his work. The world had to wait until the 16th century to rediscover what was known in the 3rd century BC. How different would the history of science and humanity's place in the cosmos have been if Aristarchus's complete arguments had been continuously available? The works of the mathematician Menelaus, whose spherical trigonometry was essential for astronomy, were largely lost. The brilliant engineer Hero of Alexandria, who described a working steam engine, an aeolipile, saw his writings scattered and fragmented. His work on automata, mechanics, and pneumatics was so advanced it would not be replicated for millennia. The complete histories of the known world, like the works of Manetho, an Egyptian priest who compiled a history of the pharaohs, survive only in fragments quoted by later, often hostile, Christian chroniclers. His king list, the foundation of Egyptian chronology, is a patchwork of what it once was. The library held the first-hand accounts of Phoenician explorers, Babylonian astronomers, and Persian magi. It was a global internet of papyrus, and its server was burned to the ground. This leads us to the central, haunting question. Was the burning of the Library of Alexandria history's single biggest setback? The answer is nuanced. It was not the only place where knowledge was lost. Other great libraries, like that of Pergamum, were dispersed. The collapse of the Roman Empire in the West led to its own dark age. But the case for Alexandria is unique and compelling. Its destruction was not merely a symptom of a general decline, it was a targeted, multi-pronged assault on the very idea of a universal repository. It was the deliberate, concentrated destruction of the largest and most organized collection of knowledge the world would see until perhaps the 19th century. The loss was not just of individual books, but of the context, the lineage of ideas, the scholarly debates that were recorded in the margins. It was the destruction of an ecosystem of knowledge. The setback was not that progress stopped, but that it had to painfully, slowly, and often incorrectly reinvent what had already been discovered. The intellectual journey of humanity was not paused. It was forced to take a massive, agonizing detour that lasted for over 1,000 years. The Renaissance, in many ways, was the rediscovery of the classical world through Arab translators who had preserved some of the knowledge that had trickled out before the final collapse. But it was a fraction, a ghost of the Alexandrian whole. Think of the centuries of scholasticism spent debating how many angels could dance on the head of a pin, while the works of Aristarchus, which could have shown them the true scale of the heavens, were ash. Consider the technological stagnation, while heroes' blueprints for steam power lay forgotten. The burning of the library created a memory hole of immense proportions, into which fell countless possibilities for science, medicine, literature, and philosophy. Down the centuries. The true tragedy of the Library of Alexandria is not just measured in the scrolls that burned, but in the ghost that those fires left behind, a phantom limb of human knowledge that aches with what might have been. To argue that its destruction was not a catastrophic setback is to ignore the sheer concentration of intellectual capital that was obliterated. While it is true that knowledge was lost elsewhere and that the library was in decline, its burning was the equivalent of deleting the primary server and all its backups in a series of cascading failures. Other losses were scattered. This was a targeted decapitation of the Western world's intellectual leadership. Consider the counter-arguments often made, that the library was already in decline by the time of Caesar's fire, that much of its knowledge had been disseminated, that the rise of parchment codexes over fragile papyrus scrolls would have rendered the collection obsolete. There is some truth in this. The library was a symbol of a specific, Ptolemaic vision of the world, and that world was changing. However, this logic is a dangerous form of historical complacency. It mistakes the vessel for the content. The shift from scroll to codex was a change in format, not in the inherent value of the information contained within. The loss of the library was not the loss of a building, but the loss of the unique, curated, and interconnected ecosystem of knowledge that building housed. A scholar in Alexandria could cross-reference a Babylonian astronomical diary with a Greek geometric proof and an Egyptian medical text. That synergistic potential, the ability to make connections across disciplines and cultures, died with the library. The knowledge that had been disseminated was the popular, the commonplace, the unique, the controversial, the specialized. The works that were only held in one place were the ones that vanished forever. The most haunting loss is the one we cannot even quantify, the works of which we have no record. For every Aeschylus or Aristarchus we know was lost, how many other geniuses have been completely erased from history? How many philosophers whose ideas could have reshaped ethics? How many physicians who discovered cures that would be lost to the plague-ridden Middle Ages? How many engineers whose visions of machinery could have launched an industrial revolution in the time of the Romans? The library was a memory bank, and its destruction caused a form of collective amnesia. We are left with the scattered, fragmented dreams of antiquity, trying to piece together the full picture of human thought with most of the pieces missing. And so, the ghost of the Library of Alexandria began to haunt the world. Its phantom presence can be felt in every subsequent attempt to gather and preserve knowledge, as if humanity has been trying to atone for a sin it can barely remember. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the Great Library of Constantinople, the monastic scriptoria of Europe that painstakingly copied texts by candlelight, all were echoes of the Alexandrian dream. The driving force behind the Enlightenment and the creation of the great national libraries of Paris and London was the same insatiable urge to collect, to categorize, to know. The modern internet itself, with its promise of universal access to all information, is the digital ghost of the Library of Alexandria, a vast, chaotic, and vulnerable attempt to rebuild what was once lost. Was its burning history's biggest setback? It was not merely a setback, it was a fork in the road of human progress, and we were forced down the slower, darker path. The world after Alexandria was a world that had to rediscover, rather than build upon. It fostered a culture where dogma could more easily suppress inquiry, because the weight of alternative evidence had been physically destroyed. The light of reason flickered low for 1,000 years. Not because humanity became stupid, but because the fuel for that fire, the accumulated, challenging, and diverse record of human thought, had been systematically taken away. The story of the Library of Alexandria is the ultimate warning about the fragility of civilization. It teaches us that knowledge is not a permanent possession, but a flame that must be vigilantly guarded and passed from one generation to the next. Its destruction proves that the barbarian is not always at the gate. Sometimes he is the general making a tactical decision, the emperor enforcing religious unity, or the mob convinced of its own righteousness. The greatest threats to our collective memory are not neglect alone, but the violent intersection of power, ideology, and accident. The line of street. Mark may rule no more in Venice, and the Lion of Alexandria no longer guards its scrolls, but their stories are forever intertwined in the same epic of human ambition and loss. The legacy of the library is a permanent scar on the psyche of the world, a reminder of how close we came to knowing everything, and how much we let slip away into the silent, ashen, dark. The story of the library's burning has itself become a kind of scripture, passed down not on papyrus, but through the echoes of historical gossip and dramatic license. To truly understand its legacy, we must separate the blazing myth from the smouldering reality. The popular imagination, fueled by films and novels, often depicts a single, catastrophic inferno, perhaps started by a zealous Caliph that turned the entire library to ash in one night of ignorant barbarism. The truth, as we have seen, is far more complex, more tragic, and in many ways more instructive. It was not a murder, but a death by 1,000 cuts, an accident of war, a brutal sacking, and a systematic ideological cleansing. This reality does not diminish the loss, it magnifies it. It shows that the greatest threats to knowledge are not always a single villain, but a cascade of human failings, ambition, conflict, and fervent belief. The most persistent myth, perhaps started by the 13th century writer Bar Hebraeus, involves the Arab conquest of Alexandria in 642 AD by the Caliph Omar. The story goes that the conquering general, Amr ibn al-As, asked the Caliph what to do with the books. Omar allegedly replied, "If those books are in accord with the Quran, we have no need of them, and if these are opposed to the Quran, destroy them." The scrolls were then used as fuel to heat the city's bathhouses for 6 months. It is a powerful, shocking tale that perfectly fits a narrative of clashing civilizations. But most modern scholars dismiss it as a later fabrication, a piece of anti-Muslim propaganda written centuries after the fact. By 642 AD, the great library of the Bruchion was already long gone, a victim of Aurelian's war. The Serapeum's daughter library had been destroyed by Theophilus and his mob. There was likely little left of the classical collection to burn. This myth, however, endures because it serves a purpose. It simplifies a complicated history into a stark moral fable about faith versus reason. The real legacy of the library is not in a single act of destruction, but in the pattern it reveals. The library fell victim to the same forces that threaten knowledge repositories throughout history. It became a political symbol. For the Ptolemies, it was a symbol of their power and enlightenment. For Caesar, it was collateral damage near a strategic target. For Aurelian, it was part of a rebellious city that needed to be broken. For Theophilus, it was a symbol of a pagan past that had to be eradicated to secure a Christian future. In every case, The intrinsic value of the knowledge within became secondary to the library's symbolic weight. The scrolls were not hated for what they said, but for what they represented to the person in power at that moment. This is the most chilling lesson of Alexandria. Knowledge is never safe when it becomes a pawn in a larger game of ideological or military conquest. And so it was that the physical library faded from the world, but its myth began to grow. Its ghost haunted the medieval world, a whispered legend of a lost golden age. During the Renaissance, as scholars desperately scoured monastic libraries for fragments of classical texts, the story of Alexandria took on a new poignancy. They were trying to reassemble the very corpse they knew had been dismembered. The Enlightenment philosophers, who championed reason and encyclopedic knowledge, saw the library as both an inspiration and a cautionary tale. They were, in essence, trying to build a new Alexandria, one they hoped would be immune to the fires of dogma and war. The myth of its single, tragic burning became a rallying cry for the preservation and dissemination of knowledge, a powerful argument against the centralization of information in a single, vulnerable location. The loss was so profound that it fundamentally shaped how subsequent generations thought about TW stand today at our own Alexandrian crossroads. We have built a new Library of Alexandria, one far vaster than the Ptolemies could ever have imagined. It is not made of marble and papyrus, but of silicon and light, the digital universe of the internet. This global network holds more information than the Great Library ever could, accessible to billions with a device in their pocket. It is the realization of the ancient dream, a universal repository of human knowledge. But in our triumph, we have recreated the very vulnerabilities that destroyed the original. The ghosts of Caesar, Aurelian, and Theophilus have not been exorcised. They have simply learned to code. Our digital Alexandria is threatened by the same triad of perils that doomed its ancestor. First, the accident of war. Not a fire in a harbour, but a sophisticated cyber attack. A single, well-placed missile could destroy a server farm housing unimaginable amounts of data. A coordinated digital assault could corrupt archives, scramble databases, and erase entire segments of our cultural record in the time it takes to burn a scroll. Our knowledge is concentrated in server farms that are as physically vulnerable as the warehouses of ancient Alexandria. Second, the ideological cleansing. Not a Christian mob, but a digital inquisition. Across the globe, governments engage in censorship on a scale Theophilus could never have dreamed of, rewriting history and erasing dissent with the click of a button. Even in the open web, the drive to sanitize, to deplatform, and to enforce a new orthodoxy creates its own form of silence, its own kind of burning. The digital scrolls that contradict the prevailing narrative are not torn, but algorithmically hidden, shadow banned, or deleted entirely. The motive is the same: to control the narrative and eliminate challenging ideas. Third, and perhaps most insidiously, is neglect and obsolescence. The papyrus, scrolls crumbled over time. Our digital storage decays too. File formats become obsolete, storage media degrades, and links rot into nothingness, creating digital dark ages. Vast swathes of early internet culture, stored on floppy disks and GeoCities pages, are already lost forever, not to fire, but to the simple, relentless march of technological progress. We are creating a mountain of data that is inherently fragile, a library built on sand. The story of the Library of Alexandria is no longer just a history lesson. It is a mirror. It forces us to ask, are we being good stewards of our own knowledge? Have we learned from the past, or are we merely repeating its mistakes on a grander, more catastrophic scale? The burning of the library was history's great setback, not just because of what was lost then, but because of the pattern it established. A pattern we seem doomed to repeat. The final lesson of Alexandria is one of profound responsibility. The Ptolemies understood that knowledge was power, but they failed to protect it from the other forms of power that would inevitably challenge it. We now hold that same power, exponentially greater. The choice is ours. Will we guard this new library with wisdom, decentralization, and a fierce commitment to intellectual freedom? Or will we, through accident, conflict, or dogma, allow our own age to be remembered for another, even greater burning? The silence that fell over Alexandria was a silence of loss. The silence that would follow the loss of our digital world would be the silence of a future that never was, a future we failed to protect. The ghost of the Great Library, does not just ask us to remember the past, it begs us to secure the future he projects of preserving human thought. To truly grasp the void left by Alexandria, we must move beyond the loss of known texts and confront the annihilation of entire disciplines and the connective tissue between them. The library was not merely a storage facility, it was a neural network of the ancient world, where the synapse between a Babylonian astronomical observation and a Greek geometrical principle could spark a revolution. This intellectual cross-pollination was its true genius, and its destruction shattered these nascent networks of thought. Consider the field of medicine. The library held not only the works of Hippocrates and Herophilus, who pioneered human dissection, but also countless texts from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and India. These works contained millennia of accumulated practical knowledge on surgery, herbal remedies, and anatomy. Their loss set medicine back immeasurably. The dark ages of medicine in Europe, with their reliance on leeches and humoral theory, were a direct consequence of this severed lineage. The works of Galen, a later Roman physician, survived and became dogma precisely because the more advanced, more challenging, and more accurate texts from Alexandria that could have contested his theories were gone. The scientific method of observation and experimentation, which flickered so brightly in Alexandria, was extinguished, replaced by centuries of deference to authority. The loss was also cultural and psychological. The complete histories of the world, written from a multitude of perspectives, were replaced by the monolithic narratives of the victors. We lost the Carthaginian account of the Punic Wars, the Etruscan history of Italy, the myriad local chronicles of the Mediterranean world. This created a flattened, Greco-Roman centric view of history that has taken modern archaeology centuries to correct. The library was a sanctuary for minority reports, for heretical ideas, for the voices that did not fit the emerging orthodoxies of Rome or the Church. Its destruction made the intellectual world a smaller, less diverse, and less interesting place. It enabled the triumph of a single story, and the price of that triumph was the rich, contradictory, and symphonic chorus of human experience that was silenced forever. The plays that were lost were not just entertainment, they were the psychological and spiritual explorations of an entire culture. Their absence left a hole in our understanding of the human psyche that not even the surviving 7 plays of Sophocles can fully fill. We are left with a magnificent but fragmented mosaic, forever wondering about the full picture. This unquantifiable loss extends to the very spirit of inquiry. The Museum of Alexandria represented a unique moment where the state funded pure research for its own sake. This model would not be seen again on such a scale until the founding of modern universities. The destruction of the library sent a chilling message to the ages, that the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake is a fragile endeavor, perpetually vulnerable to the pragmatic demands of power and the certainties of faith. The murder of Hypatia was the ultimate symbol of this shift, the thinker torn apart by the mob, the mind destroyed by the fist. The silence that followed was not just an absence of sound, but an absence of a certain kind of courage, the courage to ask questions without fearing the answer. The world after Alexandria became more cautious, more dogmatic, and less curious. The great what if questions that fuel scientific and cultural progress were suppressed for a millennium, not by a lack of intelligence, but by a lack of access to the bold ideas that dared to ask them. The story of the Library of Alexandria, therefore, is not a closed chapter. It is an ongoing conversation between the past and the present about the value we place on our collective memory. The burning of the library was history's greatest setback, because it was a preventable catastrophe that robbed us of our past and consequently altered our future. The question it poses to us now is stark. What are we doing to ensure that our digital Alexandria does not share the same fate? The vulnerability is no longer centralized in one magnificent building, but is distributed across a global network that is both resilient and terrifyingly fragile. We face new Caesars in the form of cyber warfare, new Theophiluses in the form of algorithmic censorship and digital book burning, and the simple, erosive decay of bit rot and format obsolescence. Our duty, born from the ashes of that first great library, is to learn from its mistakes. We must champion decentralization, ensuring that no single point of failure can erase our cultural record. We must fight for the principles of open access and net neutrality, protecting the digital commons from the encroachment of both corporate and state control. We must become the scribes of our own age, actively engaged in preserving digital artifacts, from significant cultural works to the mundane records of everyday life that future historians will crave. We must support the libraries and archives, both physical and digital, that stand as the bulwarks against a new dark age. The ghost of Alexandria does not ask for mourning. It demands vigilance. The flame of knowledge, once so nearly extinguished, is now in our hands. It is a flame that illuminates the path to a better future, but it can also, as we have seen, cast the long shadow of ignorance if we let it fail. The story of the libraries burning is the ultimate warning that civilization is not a permanent state, but a continuous act of preservation and creation. We honor the lost scrolls not by lamenting their loss, but by ensuring that the symphony of human knowledge continues to be written, preserved, and passed on, louder and more diverse than ever before. The final chapter of the Library of Alexandria has not yet been written. It is being written by us. In the long shadow cast by the fires of Alexandria fell across 1,000 years, but it was never a complete and utter darkness. For even as the great centralized library crumbled, its legacy was carried forward by a disparate and often unlikely group of inheritors who became the custodians of the flame through the long night of the Middle Ages. These were the scribes in isolated Irish monasteries, hunched over vellum in freezing scriptoria, meticulously copying not only the Gospels but the works of Virgil and Pliny that had somehow survived the collapse. These were the scholars of the Byzantine Empire, preserving the language and a fraction of the texts of their Greek forebears in the relative safety of Constantinople, a city that itself would eventually fall, scattering its treasures to the wind. And most crucially, these were the intellectuals of the Islamic Golden Age. In Baghdad's House of Wisdom, founded in the 8th century, the Caliphs enacted a policy that directly echoed the Ptolemies, but with a crucial difference: translation. While Alexandria sought to collect all knowledge, Baghdad sought to translate it from Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Sanskrit into Arabic. Scholars like al-Khwarizmi systematized algebra. Avicenna compiled a medical canon that would become a standard text in Europe for centuries. Ibn al-Haytham revolutionized optics. They were not merely preservers, they were innovators who built directly upon the Aristotelian and Alexandrian traditions that had been lost to the West. The works of Aristotle, which survived only in fragments in Latin Europe, were preserved in their entirety in Arabic. The intellectual lineage of Alexandria did not die. It migrated, it transformed, and it found new patrons under a different sky. This great relay race of knowledge reached a pivotal moment in the 12th and 13th centuries in places like the multicultural city of Toledo in Spain. After the Christian reconquest, European scholars flocked there, collaborating with Jewish and Muslim thinkers to translate the great works of the ancient world and the commentaries of the Islamic scholars from Arabic into Latin. It was here that Europe rediscovered its own past. The works of Aristotle, Euclid, Ptolemy, and Archimedes flooded into the nascent universities of Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. This influx of new knowledge was explosive, directly igniting the intellectual fervour of the High Middle Ages and laying the groundwork for the Renaissance. Thomas Aquinas built his entire scholastic system on the rediscovered Aristotle. The scientific method began to re-emerge from its long slumber. The flame, guarded for centuries by others, was finally passed back to the West. This grand narrative of preservation reveals a profound truth. The loss of the Library of Alexandria was not an absolute end, but a catastrophic disruption that forced knowledge onto a more perilous, decentralized, and ultimately more resilient path. It taught humanity, through the hardest of lessons, that no single repository is safe. The survival of our collective memory depends not on one great library, but on a vast, interconnected, and redundant network of copies, translations, and diverse traditions. The monks of Skellig Michael, the translators of Baghdad, and the scholars of Toledo are the unsung heroes of this story. They are the proof that the human drive to know and to preserve is indomitable. They carried the seeds from the ashes of Alexandria, and through centuries of diligent effort, helped them bloom again in a new world. The library's physical form was destroyed, but its spirit, the insatiable curiosity it represented, proved impossible to kill. The choices we make every day, to remember, to preserve, and to learn. And so, we return to the question that has haunted us through the ashes of centuries. Was the burning of the Library of Alexandria history's biggest setback? The evidence, laid bare across the ruins of time, points to a resounding and tragic yes, but not for the simple reason of lost scrolls. It was the greatest setback because it was a systemic failure, a multi-generational catastrophe that fundamentally altered the trajectory of human civilization. It was not a single event but a syndrome, the Alexandria syndrome, where the centralization of knowledge, without robust redundancy, collided with the relentless forces of political ambition, religious fervor, and mundane accident. The loss of the plays of Aeschylus is a cultural tragedy. The loss of Aristarchus's heliocentric model is a scientific catastrophe. But the loss of the ecosystem that connected them is what constitutes the true setback. It was the destruction of the world's first and most ambitious think tank, a place where the cross-pollination of ideas from different cultures and disciplines could thrive. The burning of the library did not just destroy the past, it mortgaged the future. It forced the most brilliant minds for the next 1,000 years to waste their potential, rediscovering foundational truths instead of using them as a springboard to new heights. The centuries of intellectual stagnation in Europe, often called the Dark Ages, were not an inevitable historical phase. They were, in large part, a direct consequence of the void left in the Mediterranean world after Alexandria's light was extinguished. Compare it to other historical setbacks. The Black Death killed a staggering portion of Europe's population, but it did not erase knowledge. It created social and economic upheaval that eventually led to Renaissance. The fall of Rome was a political and administrative collapse that fragmented an empire, but the knowledge of the ancients, though scattered, still existed in pockets, waiting to be rediscovered. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria was unique. It was a targeted, though not always intentional, annihilation of the very source code of Western and human knowledge at its most concentrated point. It was the equivalent of deleting the master copy of a project and all its backups simultaneously. In the end, the legacy of the library is not one of marble columns or papyrus scrolls. Its most enduring monument is the silence it left behind, a silence filled with the ghosts of 1,000,000 unwritten books, unbuilt machines, and uncharted stars. It stands as a permanent scar on the timeline of human progress, a what-if of unimaginable scale. The plays we cannot read, the cures we never found, the cosmic truths we had to painfully relearn, these are the true measures of the loss. We now live in the age of a new Alexandria, a digital one of unimaginable scope and equal vulnerability. The story of the ancient library is our ultimate warning. It teaches us that knowledge is the most precious and most fragile thing we possess. It warns us against the dangers of centralization, the arrogance of power, and the tyranny of dogma. The fires that consumed the great library are not just embers in the distant past. They are a perpetual risk, a lesson in perpetual vigilance. The final verdict is clear. The burning of the Library of Alexandria was not merely a setback. It was a pivot point where human history was forcibly switched to a slower, darker track. We are the heirs of that diminished legacy. Our mission, born from its ashes, is to ensure that such a silencing never happens again. We must become the guardians of our collective memory, building a future where knowledge is decentralized, resilient, and free, so that the great conversation of humanity, so nearly ended, may continue forever. We stand now at the end of this story, but not at the end of its meaning. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but the human impulse that built it, the desperate, beautiful need to understand our world and leave a record for those who come after, is more alive than ever. We are all inheritors of that impulse, and we are all, now, librarians of the future. The story of Alexandria is not a dirge for what was lost. It is a battle hymn for what must be preserved. Every time a student downloads a public domain classic, every time a scientist publishes an open access paper, every time an archiver saves a fragment of digital culture, we are defying the ghosts of Caesar and Theophilus. We are building a library that exists in 1,000,000 places at once, a collection whose survival does not depend on the integrity of a single wall. The burning of the library was history's greatest setback, but it was not its final word. The final word is being written by us in the choices we make every day. It is written in the code of decentralized databases, in the fight for net neutrality, in the quiet dedication of librarians and archivists, and in the simple, profound act of sharing knowledge. The chain of knowledge, so nearly broken 2,000 years ago, remains unbroken. It was passed from the scribes of Alexandria to the monks of Ireland, from the scholars of Baghdad to to the translators of Toledo, and now it passes to us. The torch is in our hands. Let us carry it forward, not in one vulnerable, glorious flame, but in a billion points of light, so that no single fire can ever again threaten to plunge the world into darkness.